Hey everybody, welcome to the Grounded Seeker podcast. My name's Sam and this is episode 8. And today this episode is all about how to consistently, being the key word, consistently love yourself in your darkest moments. And of course we're going to be weaving in things about non-duality as well. How do we show up for ourselves in that really deep suffering that these awakening-based practices can sort of precipitate? You know, I'm talking very painful things like suicidal ideation when there's just such a deep helplessness, or like a mourning anxiety, or something really strong, like a strong social anxiety, or a freeze response, or just an ongoing hum of angst in our system. How can we meet this in a reliable way for ourselves? So to do that, I give a bit of context just to lay out the landscape of this podcast around what that might look like, just set the scene a little bit, just so that you make sure you're on the same page with me. And then we continue to explore the solution later on. So I try to go into a bit of nuance with that. And then I suggest a practice and tie in some pitfalls and traps we can fall into that could make us sort of self-sabotage, letting in a practice like this and an adjustment like this. Oh, and just a quick side note, yes, there was some construction sounds, some churning sounds, some audio mishaps in this episode. My software seemed to be playing up and I'm in India right now. Doing my best. I'm sorry. Hopefully the content justifies the noises and stuff like this. I'll try to find better places in the future. I just wanted to record the episode. So thanks for understanding that too. Okay, so let's paint the scene. You know, you're a spiritual seeker, particularly in the non-dual sense, but maybe in other meditative traditions as well. I don't want to exclude you if you're in a different meditative tradition, but I tend to have more experience with non-dual seeking. And you know, you've been resting as awareness, following these pointers. People like Rupert Spira, Muji, Angelo DeLullo. And you're finding that as you're resting as awareness, you're now coming into contact with a lot of the early developmental trauma that is sort of revealing itself. And you may not be using that context that it's developmental trauma, and I'll expand your mind open to that concept later in this episode. But essentially what you're now noticing is a marked increase in somatic dysregulation, and that can happen with these awakening-based practices. The shadow comes forth, and sometimes we can be surprised with how much there is. And what you're dealing with now is a state of nervous system dysregulation that is punctuating your daily life and making it undeniably difficult to tend to daily activities. You know, it's difficult to show up in the workplace. Maybe you have some sort of like social anxiety, some sort of difficulty, some sort of recurrent stress that you're able to somewhat deal with, but it's not consistent, it's not reliable. It's sort of like this inconsistency. Like we have this sense of we're opening up to these spiritual tools. Like we have things like we know to not resist sensations, right? We know to open up our hearts to the pain rather than closing off to the pain. And we may be somewhere on a spectrum with that integration of that understanding. And we may have opened up to even like things like religious teachings in our spiritual journey, in our non-dual spiritual journey, through things like Christian mystics and stuff like this, where there's a more of a devotional aspect that's come online. We've awakened the heart to some degree, but it can still leave us with this sort of like patchwork sort of feeling where we have this somatic suffering, this emotionally based suffering that is residing in the body. And we're sort of trying on the shoes of all sorts of approaches in the spiritual marketplace. And we hear things like non-resistance. So, you know, we do that quite well. We open up our hearts to not resist experience. And yet we can do that with some emotions, with some experiences. Like maybe we've gotten really good at being with our experience at our baseline. But then when we go into certain situations, some sort of social anxiety or some sort of like fear of failure or some sort of rejection or some sort of inadequacy, shame, when we experience that in the right conditions, we all of a sudden, like the dial switches where we're now in this state of resistance. And we almost have this sort of cockroachy energy. I call it with my clients that I work with somatic inquiry, cockroach energy. Like we're all good. We can be spiritual and compassionate to some facets of our experience, but as soon as we get access to a really uncomfortable state of being, we treat it with cockroach energy, like it's something that we have to stamp out and get rid of. And we may know intellectually that we say, yeah, like I should have non-resistance to this. I should be allowing it in. And we might even beat ourselves up after the fact that we have these sorts of experiences with a feeling of like, oh, God, what's wrong with me, man? Like, why can't I've been meditating for so long and I keep going into these niche situations, experiencing these painful emotions, and I just lose it. Like I just lose the grip and I get overwhelmed, I get dysregulated. And it's just not a good experience. And then we end up beating ourselves up to some degree, and that can be really punishing. We can be really, really punishing to ourselves, even with a spiritual practice. So just a couple of examples with that. We we go into a social situation, and our inner critic, that voice inside that we all know quite well with insight-based practice and non-dual teachings and serious meditative practices. It's we hear the voice of, don't show this, man, like don't look like this, like get away, look good, you're being stupid, you're being silly. It's people with trauma, we have quite a strong inner critic. People with CPTSD, complex post-traumatic stress disorder, people with attachment wounding, our inner critic is often quite unrelenting. And then, we feel strong guilt feelings after, and then we self-abandon and we beat ourselves up, and we feel like we've sort of taken that feeling of like taking 5 steps backward, and we have to sort of recover, and it takes a while to pull ourselves out of that rut of that sort of behavior sometimes before we then sort of reboot and get back on track again. Or we might have something like a functional freeze response, where there's that sort of feeling of having a numbness in the body. This is true mostly for people who have that sort of right brain dissociation, because we learned at a young age, and often people with like avoidant attachment styles, that if we show our full spectrum of emotion, we're going to get punished for that. So our nervous system learns developmentally, this sort of stuff happens very early on, up to 6 months of age, where our parents are attuning to us and developmentally attuning to us, and then we take on these sorts of beliefs to fit in, because we're totally adaptive at that age. We learn to not feel and express our emotions. So sometimes some of us with trauma might just have a sort of numbness that we go about in the world, that really just a numbed out feeling of being buried alive. I've heard it described as like there's this feeling of being the Walking Dead to a degree, like we're just so disconnected from our emotions. And then, we practice non-duality. Okay, I'll feel the numbness, I'll soften into it. But we sort of have this looming background sense that if we were to give it to a voice, it's sort of something like, okay, I'm feeling this, I'm opening up to this, I'm allowing myself to feel this numbness. But how do I get rid of this? How do I get rid of this thing? What's wrong with me? What's wrong with me? Why do I keep feeling this numbness? Like, if we were to really voice that background sense, and we sort of just glaze over that, and then often our strategy is to double down on that practice, on that insight-based practice. Okay, well, all right, if I just keep resting as awareness, if I just double down even harder as resting as awareness, maybe, I watched this YouTube video of this person who looked like they had this big breakthrough experience, or this teacher said this and how they had this big awakening experience, and then all like Eckhart Tolle, all this trauma just evaporated. Maybe I'll have the same experience. So I'll just double down on this meditation practice and this functional freeze, this numbness, this inner critic that's raging, this energetic background angst will just evaporate, So it's like, okay, let's stay open to that. Let's keep that door open. Maybe some sort of breakthrough like that might happen. There might be like, I don't know, I don't want to give statistics to it, because I'm so for having an open mind. I think as soon as we plant ourselves firmly in any position, oppositional position toward anything that we take too seriously, we're just cutting ourselves off from the possibility of insight. So just holding it loosely that, yeah, like, okay, this teacher had this breakthrough, this person on this video had this breakthrough. I might have a breakthrough like that. And I still have this very uncomfortable experience. And I'm going to trust my instinct to know if I need to double down on this practice, or if I'm doubling down on this practice because I'm avoiding something more primary that's right in front of my face. This numb, buried alive sensation. You know, I'll stay open. Maybe it needs a different approach to what the teacher's telling me. Because that's another trait of people with trauma, is we put the opinions of authority figures above our own instinct. And people in these sorts of situations, for example, when we go on these 10-day Vipassana retreats, I got this from Willoughby, Britain. It's very true and something I experienced. We might be very ardent about sticking rigidly to the practice that is prescribed to us, which has a degree of respect, and sometimes, you know, we want to do that on retreats to a degree. And yet, if it's not working for us, because we've disowned our experience so much, we put authorities on the pedestal. Yes, keep giving. What do I need to do? You tell me what I need to do. You tell me. You know, I'm not going to trust myself because I'm still suffering so much. I have this trauma that I feel unworthy and I feel like I'm a bad human. So I'm going to trust the teacher who looks like, you know, they're so peaceful, calm, collected. But no, we need to bring that back in to our experience, into our core. Feel what our truth is. Be in integrity within ourselves. Okay, so that's a bit of a tangent. But you get the point. I'm setting this scene here that how do we work with this intense energy when this is arising? And I'm just throwing in little bits and pieces here that might expand upon your journey that I've found to be very important for myself. Basically, what we're talking about for the majority of people in this camp is how do we deal with this inbuilt function that seems to be ingrained into our nervous system, because truly it can be from developmental trauma of I'm bad for feeling this sensation, this numbness, this explosive energy. I'm bad for feeling this. What's wrong with me? And then we fall into victim energies like, it's hopeless. I've been meditating for so long and I just can't get it right. You know, and we're moving reliably and consistently toward unconditional positive self-regard, self-empowerment, and a healthy self-esteem. So how do we open to the like quote unquote no-go zones that we consistently abandon ourselves in and reliably show up for ourselves? That creates this sort of like net of safety in our experience where we know that like no matter what I'm feeling, whether it's suicidal ideation, that intensity of experience, whether it's just adrenal fatigue at the end of a long day after work when I've been triggered 6 times in the day and I just feel like I just want to just pass out and fall asleep forever on my bed, whether it's crippling morning anxiety that is just so it's pulsating through the body and I'm dreading the day, whether it's just such a strong social anxiety where I'm in a freeze response and I'm in a fawn response, or I'm in a fight response and I'm just so deeply activated and I'm feeling this overwhelming guilt for the way that I acted. No matter what the experience, bar none, if I could say that again, but bar none, I will not abandon myself. I will not give up on myself. I'm going to treat this experience with absolute positive regard. Even if I slip up for a moment, even if I feel like I'm absolutely decimated with sensation, I immediately, as soon as I recognize that, I'm going to get up, brush myself off, and keep going. Oh, I gave into a distraction, a dysfunctional behavior to cope with my unpleasant experience. Okay, I noticed that. All right, buddy. I see that. I see that you really needed that distraction. Oh, all right, sweetheart. how can we recalibrate and treat myself with the love and respect that I would if I was looking after a 2-year-old version of myself, a 1-year-old, 2-year-old version of myself that I loved so deeply and unconditionally, ongoing. I've had a couple of clients where this sort of thing comes into focus, where it's so interesting how the mind compartmentalizes like certain experiences under certain conditions, that it's almost like it has an internal working model and a set of neurons that fire in given circumstances, that as a coping strategy, as an innocent coping strategy, our mind has sort of cuts itself off from compassion in those instances, because in childhood we weren't taught the regulation skills, or we just feel like there's so much shame associated with such an emotion that we never really fully learn to deal with it. So we've just built this, we have like an internal working model to some emotional experiences that are just overwhelming. We're going to sort of rewire that internal working model to be unconditionally available for our emotional experience. And when it comes to me, I was doing the non-dual practice, right? I was consistently and ardently practicing 2 hours a day, bringing the practice off the cushion, and I would deal. Obviously, I can't talk about these sorts of things if I haven't dealt with these things myself. So things for me, like having a need to like isolate from people and these sorts of things, which fed into meditation. Just having this like shame body that exists, that there's some core defect wrong with me, or something like that, and social anxiety earlier on especially was very strong, but now there's sort of like a more of a personal integrity that I've cultivated with myself, where I understand myself a lot more. So I know these places, I know them very well, and that core shame that trauma can breed, complex trauma and these sorts of things that can breed, it can be very suffocating. And we also need to not buy into that as a victim story, because we absolutely can show up for ourselves consistently. And that's been my experience. And a quote comes to mind that I read in a fantastic book, The Loving Parent Guidebook by the ACA team, ACA Resources, Adult Children Resources. And the quote goes like this: "We can reparent, not because we, quote, have to, or because we want to get rid of the pain, but because it is the kindest response to pain." So in doing this, we're going to reparent ourselves, and that sort of is a bit of a teaser for the solution of what we're going to be talking about with this sort of painful experiences, these painful experiences that I've alluded to. We're not trying to get rid of it, but we're trying to show up to ourselves with compassion consistently and replace our internal working model, because it simply is the kindest response to pain. And yes, well, certainly we will rewrite some of these old emotional learnings that we developed through childhood by working with the sort of underlying emotional experience that didn't have enough safety or attunement or love or support in the moment that it arose in our nervous system. Like there was a reason why it was created. While we can rewrite those emotional learnings very effectively now, there is incredible science, that I'm working with people with memory reconsolidation, with essentially rewiring the mind once we have a presenting symptom, and then we can work it all the way back to the core affecting place, and then essentially rework that, reparent that. Although the stance that we want to take is one of absolutely positive, compassionate regard to every facet of our experience, just like that quote says, with an attitude of we're not trying to get rid of it, which I know can be confusing at first, because in a sense we're trying to get rid of it, and by you could take that stance very easily initially. So it takes a subtle but vital shift, I will say. Fucking vital, to shift toward positive regard toward these emotional experiences. We need to take that, oh, okay, to use an example of some of the language we might use. Of course you feel that way in that situation, buddy. Yeah, come here, let me feel you. Yeah, tell me all about it. Tell me what makes you feel that tightness that you're feeling right now, buddy. Imagining like an inner child sort of speaking with a little 2-year-old boy or a 2-year-old little princess, little girl. Sweetheart, oh yeah, I can see that tightness you've been feeling your whole life. Tell me about that. Oh, okay. And then almost like letting that emotion speak, like, might say something like, oh, yeah, I'm so scared. I'm so scared of people. And then, oh, yeah, you're scared of people. Yeah. You get the point. See how we're taking the positive side of it. We can also reparent and show that part the other side, which is really what memory reconsolidation is. Updating that emotional learning and reinforcing it with absolute positive regard from a very deep embodied reparenting energy that is very important to cultivate. And there are different therapies and approaches that don't really take that approach, but I really do believe that that is critical. And, I do this work very sincerely. And until that shift happened, real work didn't really, like positive well-being didn't really take form until that shift took place. So I want to add that in too. Because, yeah, man, we're so hard on ourselves with spirituality. We can be, especially if we have trauma, right? It doesn't help that we put these unrealistic expectations on ourselves sometimes. I know with myself and clients that I've worked with, it's sort of like, man, I'm been meditating for so long, like I should, using that word should, we should all over ourselves. I should be able to be less socially anxious now. I should be able to like just not be so frozen. Like, what's wrong with me? What am I doing wrong? And, we sort of have this background sense of I should be beyond this. And that can be felt like overtly. We might be telling ourselves and straight up beating ourselves up, or we might have it at the sort of like pre-verbal energetic layer, like I sort of alluded to with the functional freeze energy, where it's just this sense of like, when is this going to go away? Like, oh my God. Just this niggling sense that's just, it's like, I just want to feel better. Like, I just want to feel healthy, right? So it's important to consider that there are many ways that we can love ourselves consistently in our darkest moments. What I'm going to suggest is a very deep approach that really tackles the issue of how we can meet ourselves in our darkest moments when there's really no one else around. Between sessions where we're not in a therapy session, for example, what do we do in the hours, days between a session where we're not working with a practitioner to support our trauma integration, if we're doing that sort of work? What do we do when we're laying in bed alone at night in a deep emotional activation, feeling sincere and painful emotional avoidance? How can we relate to ourselves when the only thing we want to do in the moment when we're all by ourselves is just distract ourselves, we're feeling strong emotion, and we just want to get away from the pain? How can we meet this energy, right? So what I'm talking about is that there are many ways we can do this. And I don't want to oversell you on something that makes you have this sense that this is going to be the solution, and then only to, we try it on for a couple of days, we get really excited, we're like, yes, this practice is great, and then we sort of like self-sabotage, or we fall into a deep reactive pattern, and then we think that, oh, it's just so hopeless. We take that 5-step back sort of feeling, right? So it's important to consider that this isn't the whole solution. It is a powerful solution that's going to attempt to update our internal working model that will enable us to more reliably stand up in the face of suffering and meet it with the energies and loving compassion that it needs. However, I want you to remember when I'm talking to you about this stuff that it's not the complete solution. Like we still need, we're social creatures, we have needs. And I know non-dual practitioners, serious spiritual practitioners might resist hearing this sort of stuff, but we are social creatures. We need to reach out to people. We find benefit in things like community as well, where especially like vulnerable sharing communities, where we see other people going through similar struggles. It normalizes our pain, our suffering. We don't feel so alone. We need to, do things like have a healthy diet. We need routine. We need stability. We need to have like a sense of purpose and meaning. Again, another controversial thing that I think a lot of people in non-dual spheres might reject. So again, using your own instinct and discernment to feel if that's true for you or not, just really listening to that place deep within you. We can also benefit from things like, going for walks in nature. And what I'm trying to get at, though, is the most underlying factor that drives all of that sort of behavior, that encourages us to do that sort of behavior in a healthy way, is largely coming from updating our internal working model to be our loving parent towards ourselves. So that really is what I'm going to incline you to do in this episode. That's how we consistently show up for ourselves, is by becoming our loving parent. I sort of mentioned it before, but taking on that attitude of, if I was looking after a 2-year-old boy who I loved deeply, or a 2-year-old girl, 2-year-old princess, sweetheart, what would I do in this moment? So a lot of the time that takes just a slowing down, a breathing into our body, catching up with our sensations, and having a bit of metacognition to realize that we're falling into a self-destructive behavior, which is a skill in and of itself, and it takes time, but just catching ourselves and then consistently sort of coming at the attitude of, okay, I'm dysregulated. I'm really dysregulated. This certain piece of suffering, this has gotten me before, and I've just fallen into a self-deprecating spiral downward. But if I were to really meet that inner child now before I distract, for me, it's something like, watch YouTube, play video games. I've been getting back into like a all-time classic game I used to play when I was young, Diablo 2, for example, or even like RuneScape, playing these games occasionally. But they can quickly become a distraction. So how do we, what I'm trying to say is, how do we catch ourselves when we're right on the cusp of falling into that behavior, like I'm talking to, and consistently show up for ourselves, so that we get the sense of like excitement and empowerment that we've got our own backs. Now, the most powerful way that I've come across to do this is the ideal parent protocol. Now, this protocol was developed by Daniel P. Brown, a Mahamudra meditation master and clinical psychologist. And I believe the backstory is in Tibet, or in wherever Dan studied as a meditation master, Dan P. Brown, the late Dan P. Brown. He's since passed away tragically in 2021, I believe. They use a lot of ideal mother imagery in these meditation schools. So Dan Brown took that concept and brought it over to the West for the treatment with his colleague, I can't remember his name right now, to treat attachment-related disturbances. So attachment, avoidant attachment, anxious attachment, disorganized attachment. And the idea is, what we're doing in this sense is we imagine an ideal parent, parental figure, an ideal mother, an ideal father, in an ideal situation. And these ideal parents are consistently, reliably, and absolutely devoted to meeting our needs, our emotional needs. And the idea is to do this meditation as much as we possibly can, as long as we do it with a degree of consistency, 10 minutes a day, 3 to 6 times per week at a minimum sort of thing. So I'm talking about we're doing a consistent practice over a prolonged period of time. Now you can see that this is an investment, right? We're investing in our mind. And I understand that when we have a lot of suffering like this, where we're in the way that I've been describing, it can be very difficult to make a shift, especially if we're really fixated on a practice. Say fixated lightly, we might earnestly be dedicated to a practice. I'll reword that. Because we're sincere about overcoming suffering, we feel like if we add any more practices to our already, like our current regimen, and we've already been let down by so many practices in the past, like self-help practices or whatnot, what have you, that if we add anything more, it's just going to overwhelm us. It's not going to work like all the other practices, etc., etc. So we're using discernment here to see if this is something that I would be interested in adding to my sort of tool belt. But ultimately, this is the reason I suggest this practice is because it is just so deeply transformative at the root of our developmental lives. Reason is because sometimes we have an intellectual understanding of why we do the things we do, why the way we are. And then we have an emotional understanding. That's my big thing. And that's why I work with somatic modalities. Somatic being of the emotion body is because I believe that the body keeps the score. Our deepest trauma, our deepest developmental trauma formed way before we were cognizant of our intellectual mind developed. If you think of a river flowing down a mountain, at the very top where we're first born, it's very pure. The water's very pure and untainted. There's just a complete innocence. And then as soon as we're put out into the world, we're given birth to, all of a sudden we have parents who are injecting their own developmental trauma and their ways of relating. Their internal working model is engaging with our internal working model. And we don't have a rational cognitive mind at this point in time, very early in development. I can't remember the exact year developmentally, but this sort of stuff doesn't really develop for quite some time. And we take on emotional imprints at that age. We're like a sponge, a neural sponge. And this is where our attachment system develops in the very early years of development. Now, these learnings are emotional in nature. They are baked into our nervous system to such a degree to basically get our needs met from our caregivers. And that creates our internal working model with the way that we relate to our experience, with the way that we relate to others. So for example, if mum rejected my cries and my pleas, my erratic expression of emotion, maybe my tantrums or my sadness or my happiness even. If mum rejected these aspects of me, I need to suppress them because my life depends upon it to get my needs met. And the child being like a river, originally so pure, the water starts flowing down the mountain. We start getting this, forming a river, right? And we start getting these blockages in the system. Okay, if I express anger, then mum doesn't appreciate me. I don't get my needs met. I get sent to my room, or I get put in my crib and I don't get attention. So man, I better not express anger. And my body, instead of feeling anger, it's going to develop a coping strategy that feels sadness instead. So I get cut off from my anger, and now I only feel sadness. And that is felt as a protective mechanism in the nervous system, as somewhat of a contraction, some sort of resistance, in just to not over confuse you, but in IFS terminology, internal family systems, they use the word protector. We develop protectors to not feel our core affecting emotions. These sorts of things. And mind you, it could be the other way as well. So maybe developmentally, we find that our parents don't respond to us at a more subdued level of expression. But then we end up acting out. And when we notice when we have a tantrum, we really get angry, or we really get sad, and we just crying really loudly or punching a wall or something like that. Only then do our parents respond. So in order to get our needs met, we need to be hyper expressive to get that need met, right? So you get the point. At this early developmental time in our life, we're not using our rational mind. This information is stored in our body. And by creating new ideal parents who meet our emotional needs consistently, reliably, with a deep degree of safety, with a deep degree of soothing, reassurance, with a deep degree of celebration for our need to exist, for the very fact that we exist, for who we are, that encourage us to go out and explore in the world and develop a healthy sense of self. If we can meet these needs through imagination processes, that as Dan Brown intended and his colleague with the development of this sort of practice, in fact, the only practice for treating developmental related attachment wounding and trauma, doesn't have to just be developmental attachment wounding. You can imagine if we have this unconditional positive regard and meet all of these criteria of love, acceptance, safety, soothing, joy, and expressions of joy toward us for any sort of suffering that's arising, but especially for us with a lot of trauma, which, to be honest with you, most people in spiritual practices do have trauma, right? Because why would we turn to spirituality otherwise? Then what we're doing by consistently showing up for ourselves in such a way, no matter the suffering, is we're creating this, we're rewiring all of those deep emotional imprints that are in our subcortical brain, in our primal brain, in our amygdala, that come online when we're triggered, that come online when we're activated. And meeting it in a way and giving ourselves the requirements that our needs can get met that we thought were never possible before. And my experience when we do this sort of work is that it can be quite jarring. You know, we have a sense of the fact that we have presenting symptoms of trauma in our lives, but the more we do a process like this of meeting our emotional needs consistently, the more that we realize, if we take this practice on sincerely, that holy shit, like I really did not get my needs met and I had no idea. And I'm like a 40-year-old male, 50-year-old male even. And it's so evident that the body creates resistance or has some sort of like deep visceral reaction or positive reaction or nervous system regulation that occurs when we can meet our needs in such a way, right? So the Ideal Parent Protocol is one powerful way to do this. And what I'll do is I will either link one of my own guided meditations or a guided meditation in the comments or in the description for you guys to look at and try on to see what I mean by this. I've sort of included one in a guided meditation in this podcast before as well, but I'll do a more formal one or link you to a formal one, and you can get a sense of that. So the key thing would be with a practice like that is consistency, right? Consistency. It takes time to undo the emotional learnings. And in fact, we know this to be scientifically backed because granted, there isn't a huge amount of evidence supporting these sorts of practices as it is, because it's quite new. I think the actual treatment of these sort of related problems, attachment-related disturbances, comprehensive treatment for attachment repair, which is the book, by the way, by Daniel P. Brown, that released in like 2017, right? So it's a pretty new practice. But the studies that are showing that this sort of practice, when done consistently and under the guidance of someone who can actually deliver such a practice, they're getting treatment effect sizes of 6.2 compared to the like average for treatment effect size of 0.8 for other sort of treatments for treating mental disturbances, which is, by the way, treatment effect size is just a benchmark sort of statistic that is used and universally agreed upon for treatment effectiveness. In another study for CPTSD, a pilot study with, I think it had like 17 people in it, they saw over a period of time that there was only moderate to high degrees of of positive affect on these people. So basically treating these mental disturbances reliably, because again, they're reworking their internal working model. And with that pilot study I just mentioned, we're talking about an 8-month follow-up period where it was still effective. So it absolutely works scientifically as well. So it's not just, speculation here. And okay, so ideal parent protocol aside, there are, of course, other ways to be our own loving parent towards ourselves. So if we use ideal parents, that's really powerful because we can really attune to those early developmental aspects of ourselves, that emotional learning, and these sort of updating the internal working model that we learned at childhood by using these ideal parents to get our most fundamental needs met. That begins to shift our internal working model so that our baseline level of operation, so that when we have like a strong sense of suicidal ideation, for example, or a strong sense of ongoing anxiety that's just kicking our ass, or a sense of mourning anxiety or something like this, right? All those things I've been mentioning through this podcast, our default response is immediately one of unconditional positive regard and non-resistance and loving acceptance. One of, oh, darling, of course you feel that way, because consistently practicing over a long period of time gives us this updated internal working model, which seeks to meet the needs of our own internal experience as the default response, rather than this sort of like pre-verbal sense of, oh, what's wrong with me? Why I'm such a bad meditator? And we might even still have these sorts of thoughts arise, but even that is attuned to by this updated internal working model, which is cultivated consistently through a sort of practice like this. So yeah, there are other practices too. We could use something like Tonglen meditation. We could use something like sitting, like chair talking, like imagining a part of us as an inner child sitting on a chair in front of us. And we have a dialogue with this activated, triggered part of ourselves and really seek to understand and see the positive sides of it and basically, like rework that internal working model. Or we can use things like coherence therapy, schema therapy, or, like what I do, somatic inquiry, which incorporates all of these things that I'm talking about anyway. I really work this in with my clients, that I do all this stuff with them anyway, to work at these things. But if you think about it, it's almost like, I don't know, we just want something that's consistently orienting us toward a baseline level of compassion, and attuning to ourselves in such a way. And to be honest, I really, like, for me, that ideal parent protocol has been the most powerful because it really focuses heavily on doing this. Like, sometimes we don't even know what we need until we do a practice like this. And then this practice reveals to us that, oh man, I always wanted to just have someone put their hand on my shoulder. When I imagine these ideal parents doing that for me, that are perfect for me in every way, it's like, that's what I always needed. And then we show up for ourselves in that way consistently. Now, there are a couple of traps that are important to note, I think, especially for non-dual seekers. So, and I just want to sort of rapid fire them a little bit without going into a crazy amount of depth, just so you know that these things can arise. So one of the traps that I notice is that when we try a new practice like this, we might get some benefit initially, right? We try how to practice, we get strong benefit, and then after something like 1 to 2 weeks, we self-sabotage, and we get this sense of like unworthiness, and we fall into a really deeply reactive pattern or schema, but basically just being an emotional learning of man, nothing works for me. And then, then we just self-sabotage, and we might see like no significant increase in results for a while. And then we self-sabotage. And then we basically say, oh God, nothing works for me. And then we go looking for another practice to fill that void in our experience. It's worth noting that that can definitely happen, especially if we're suffering a lot. We tend to bounce around from practice to practice to practice to practice, looking for the thing that's going to fix our core shame. That is really what we're dancing around, our core shame, our deepest repressed emotions, and these sorts of things. Just be mindful that that sort of thing can happen. And I want to also caution that in some situations, right, we might have painful emotions and coping strategies that just feel like absolutely necessary. For example, like the social anxiety and the masking and these sorts of things that can come up as a result, where we put on a fake mask to conceal our true authentic self. So while this is okay, sort of okay, and it's inevitable, we can gently, using the guidance of these ideal parents, like remind ourselves that we do matter, that we have a right to look after ourselves. We have a right to feel and reparent our inner children, no matter what the sensation is, no matter how uncomfortable, no matter how necessary it feels to sort of like stick to the old way of being. And this will take time. This will be gradual. We can be very compassionate with ourselves and just take that approach of, oh, buddy, I saw you got activated there. And I saw that you fell into that reactive pattern. And it might be very uncomfortable. Like we might be in a freeze state talking to this inner child with that a very thin sense of self energy. And yet it is possible. It absolutely is possible. And as we continue to build out our nervous system, we again remember that it is the most idealized response, because it's just the most compassionate thing to do as soon as we can catch that. Another thing we can do is we can use non-dual concepts like isn't the self just an illusion? Why should I imagine myself as an inner child? Why should I imagine parts of my psyche? Eckhart Tolle said this, Angelo DeLullo said this, or some teacher said this. No shade on those teachers or anything. Like sometimes our ego lets these things in, and it fixates on them quite a lot, because we're trying to rightfully understand what the best path forward is for us to end our suffering, sometimes out of a lot of desperation. My experience with this is just, it's often rooted in doubt, sense of helplessness, maybe desperation, and a strong fixation on one technique. We need to know that with non-dual practice, there's nothing wrong with content. There's nothing wrong with, imagining an inner child or something like that. Insight eventually encapsulates everything, in my experience, and shows us that everything is allowed. Even thoughts aren't a problem. So if we take that attitude, that can help quell that the self is an illusion mentality that we can use as, sometimes, like what I found I used it as was a coping strategy to avoid going to these uncomfortable places, because I was so desperate to get beyond myself. But now I can hold both perspectives, and it feels beautifully balanced. And we might also buy into certain thoughts. I know a lot of the people who watch my channel watch people like Angelo DeLullo, and the whole practice, this is sort of loosely tied into that previous thing as well. The whole practice is basically de-identifying from thoughts. Like you might have a thought like, but this teacher said I should disidentify from all images and thoughts. Or, if I take on too many practices, I'll be overwhelmed. So, there might be some legitimacy to these things, practicing early. So I would encourage you to trust your intuition. And that can be confusing if we don't really know what our instinct is. So again, I have to share from experience that these sorts of things, they can be ways that we bypass in subtle ways. Or if we don't trust ourselves, which at first can be quite difficult, but we really need to work on that muscle of self-trust to let that guide our inner experience. So if you're resonating with what I'm saying in this episode, then just keep that in mind, that if I valued myself and I thought my opinion really mattered, should I try something like this? Or does it feel more right for me to just continue down de-identifying from thoughts, resting as awareness, these sorts of things? Really trust yourself. And of course, we can, another thing of CPTSD is we can, or any sort of trauma, developmental trauma, or these sorts of things, we can compare ourselves incessantly to other people. But this person on this interview that I watched on YouTube, they had this awakening and then all of their trauma just evaporated. Or why can't I be like that? These sorts of things. Becoming our own loving parent is about shifting the locus of consciousness very much inward toward ourselves, I find. Reclaiming our power initially. Especially if we have trauma, we have a lot of adaptions that are constantly looking outwardly to the world around us, trying to make sure everyone else is okay, trying to meet everyone else's needs, basically with this sense of we don't matter and other people are better than me. But when we become our own loving parent, we become deeply on our own side, consistently showing up for ourselves in our darkest moments, then we come to a more consistent and deep realization that the only reason that I'm comparing myself to other people is just out of an act of self-abandonment, because it's essentially self-rejection in that process. So if we can just bring it back to ourselves by feeling our bodies, feeling our core in any given moment, and just showing up for ourselves, this is what's happening right now for me, then that's how we do it. That's how we do the deep work. And yeah, so I hope this helps you guys. I really do hope this helps you. Again, this is what I do with people. A lot of this can be a bit tricky to understand at first. So feel free to book a free clarity call with me if you want to work with me, do some sessions to really let this in at a deeper level. I'm getting really great results with clients. You can check the testimonials out. And so I know I've been talking about this for a while, and truth be told, I just want to take it slow and really create an ideal program that I really would want to, which is going to implement all of these teachings. I've been talking about creating a 90-day program for some time now, and I'm just taking it slow. Admittedly, with my own stuff coming up with like procrastination and fear of failure, like these sorts of schemas that I'm working through within myself, because I'm still doing the work too. But I want to create something that's really beautiful, really transformative for people over a 90-day period, where I'm putting all of these principles into practice over 90 days. So, 12 sessions, I'm going to be tracking your progress. I'm going to be giving you access to guided meditations, a content library to learn all of these things in depth, in a much deeper and richer way, in a more organized way as well. And much more. I'm gonna be really doing that and doing it well for people to have a true transformational experience with trauma in their lives. So sign up to my newsletter to get notified when that will be releasing. And yeah, I hope you found this helpful, guys. Let me know in the comments what you found useful. If you have any questions. And yeah, I just wish you a lot of love. If you've made it this far on the podcast, you obviously care about this work. And I love people who are interested in the depth of this work as I am. So yeah, I'll see you in the next episode.